Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this show on LHI Circle. Today, we touch upon a topic that has been an area of great focus for us at Live History India, because we really believe it is time that we looked deeply and focused on the story of women through history. Let's be honest, history has done a terrible disservice to women because it is really his story when you look back at the past. We know that women would have played an important role at any time in any part of society, but their stories have never really been chronicled, told, and we really have to sift through a lot of material to find the heroines from Indian history. So Live History India at the very start started a section called Her Story, where we consciously tried to look out for more women and kind of bring out their stories. And one of the authors I really enjoy reading is Ira Mukherjee, who's done a phenomenal job in looking at deep into archives and texts to bring out the stories of these women. She's written 4 books, of course. The third was in Akbar. Again, he was a Renaissance man. So we accept him as, again, somebody who had so many great facets to admire. But Ira joins us today to talk about her latest book, Draupadi, and of course, the work that she has done across the genre, so to say. And it gives me great pleasure, Ira, to welcome you on the show today.
Thank you so much, Minnie, and thank you for all the work that you do and the encouragement.
Ira, of course, one of my favorite stories about you, and I remember sitting in Bengali market and eating chaat with you once, and you were telling me how you started on this quest. And I think it's a beautiful story because most people don't realize that you're actually, you started thinking about writing about women at a time when you were doing pure sciences as your master's at Cambridge. And you had 2 daughters and you decided that, you must start looking at this. Please tell us how you ventured into this space.
Yes, thank you, Minnie. So yes, it's a slightly longer tale than that, but you're right in that, when I was growing up and I was studying, and I was always very interested in literature and writing and creative writing. But, in my generation, if you were a vaguely capable student, you were encouraged to go into the arts and into the sciences because the humanities and the arts were not considered serious subjects. So I stumbled into the sciences, really, into biology and natural sciences. So I studied that at university. I went on to do a master's as well, as you were saying, in natural sciences. And I worked for a while in that. But over the years, I found that I wasn't deeply enough interested in the subject, and I sort of went down the route of pharmaceuticals and that sort of thing. And it just didn't grab my interest over time. And then I was in India, I got married, and I had 2 daughters. And this was the time where I started thinking about things like the stories we tell our children. I think as a parent, you are much more careful about the information that you give your children. How do you contribute to the tapestry of their memories? This was something that really concerned me. And there's this thing which I call the foundational story that we tell each other. We tell it at a national level sometimes about how our country has come about, what are the stories that go into making it, and even on a familial level, there'll be some elder person who will go on transmitting stories of this family, or this is our clan, we came from here, then we went there, we achieved these things. There's always that sort of transmission of knowledge that happens, especially in the large families. And mine was a very small family. Like I think a lot of the urban families nowadays are nuclear families. So you are in a sense deracinated from these foundational stories that you often tell each other. And so I became more interested in the sort of stories that I would tell my daughters. And so this was around the time that I started thinking about the epics, and I realized that around us, in our mythology, in our subconscious, our culture, our pop culture, the stories that are told to us are often the stories of mythological women. The historical women are forgotten, they are obscured under layers of misinformation and disinterest, really. It's the mythological women who come to us in different forms and different guises, and fed to us from a very young age. And so this was something that I was looking out for, and I noticed. And of course, the first person that comes to mind in this situation is Sita, because she is really often offered to us as an example of a perfect, Indian woman of wifely submission. And so this was something that bothered me, because while I might have accepted it for myself, I was not willing to accept this for my daughters. So when we went to see the Ram Leela, every year in the ballet troupe which performed it, the story always stopped at the stage where Sita comes back with Ram and they're all reunited, in a happy family. But we know as adults that the story continues, that despite Sita being this perfect Pativrat, this perfect example of wifely submission, she is still, her chastity is questioned and she is cast out. So this was something that troubled me, and this brought me to the idea of purity and impurity, pollution, and what is considered polluting. Things like even Kanya Puja that we do, in various societies in India. We are very happy to have this ritual where we worship young girls, and it's lovely to be part of it, or to have your daughters chosen. But what are we really saying? We are saying that pre-pubertal girls are to be worshipped as goddesses, but the minute they start menstruating, they are impure. They are polluted. So, what does this tell us for the journey of a woman going on? That she cannot perform certain rites when she is menstruating. She cannot do certain things. She is considered impure. So this idea of pollution, of pure versus impure, was something that really started, taking up a lot of my attention. And I thought it would be an interesting way to view something which could be considered storytelling for young women in the 21st century. And so that brought me to my very first, in fact, Song of Draupadi is my very first manuscript.
Yes. In fact, it's interesting because this is the fourth book you've published, but this is the first book you wrote. And I think you were telling me that you wrote this 8 years back.
Yes.
I want to ask you, Draupadi is perhaps the most colorful of figures. She's got all the imperfections that you could think of. Yes. She stands her ground. I mean, she's a wonderful character in herself. What about her did you like the most that you actually went into it? And in Draupadi itself, there's so many renditions. If I'm not mistaken, there are 28 versions of the story of Draupadi alone. So how did you go about figuring out which one to pick out?
Yes, that's a really interesting question. And so Draupadi, I came to really almost as a reaction to Sita. I knew that I did not, even though Sita is a more complex character than she's, in the way she's presented to us, Draupadi is almost the antithesis of Sita. So if we say this notion that I was talking about, this idea of pollution, Draupadi almost co-opts this idea of pollution in the way I see her story. So when she is, for example, living her 13 years in exile, when she and her husbands are asked to leave Hastinapur and to live in exile, she has her hair open, she is ungroomed, because the humiliation that occurs to her initially in the sabha happens to her when she is menstruating, when she's in a polluted state. But she refuses to hide that. She, in fact, co-opts that idea of a woman who is polluted and decides to use it for her own purpose in seeking justice, in seeking retribution for herself. So during those 12 years and plus the 13th years as well in exile, she remains in front of her husband with her hair open, which is a sign of an undomesticated woman, a feral woman almost in Indian society. You're meant to have your hair, tied up and groomed. And she recalls this idea of blood, which is highly polluting when it's associated with women. And she tells her husband that I will not tie up my hair unless it is drenched in the blood of my enemy. So I found that such a powerful story, one that we need to recall and remember and maybe tell each other today. And that she uses this extremely sort of volatile image to channel her anger, because she is one of the rare women, I think, in mythology who really is able to express her anger. So that was one thing that was very clear in my mind. I did not want a woman who was meant to be quiet like Sita. I wanted a vocal, fiery, tempestuous, angry woman. And as for the idea of the many Mahabharats, as you know, the Mahabharata has been written and rewritten over hundreds of years. It was first told in oral form, and then it was written down over several. The scholars don't even agree on how many hundreds of years it took to finally come to the last, version of it, if you like. And then what we have is this huge rambling text of 75,000 verses, I think 18 books of it. And what happened in the early 20th century, in I think around 1933, the group of scholars in Pune and the Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institute decided to look at these Sanskrit texts and try to find the area where these stories overlapped, so as to find a common origin story, if you like, one which was closest to the very earliest form of the Mahabharata. If you're talking about 600 years, more or less, give or take 100 years, over which the Mahabharata was written, they tried to find the earliest possible version. And they brought, over 40 years, it took them looking at this text, and they brought out what is called the critical edition. So it is much shorter. It focuses on the action, if you like, on what happens. There is less of the poetry. There's less of the literary flourish. There's less philosophy as well, and less digression and less religion. So what you have, because I think what happened, what scholars have said has happened, is that after all, it was all written by Brahmin men. So when we talk about the voices of women, this is a sort of female ventriloquism. You know, this is not female voices. It is the way in which men think that females talk or think or act, right? So you will have a version where a woman will do something, and then you can see that later on another Pandit has come around and said, this thing that she is said to have done or said, like criticize her husband, it's really rather worrying, and I don't think it is relevant anymore. So he put a long digression on the morality or philosophy of talking in this way, of how you should control your temper or not laugh too loudly. And it is really very, very amusing to see how these, but they leave the voices in there, but they keep correcting or overcorrecting or adding little digressions. So the critical edition is what I looked at.
Right. You know, I must bring this, the visual, the Raja Ravi Verma painting that Nehal put out of Draupadi.
Yes,
of course, it's complete sacrilege to question Raja Ravi Verma. He's, you know,
absolutely
the god of art in India. But look at that image. I mean,
that's
almost
right.
a submissive, you know, woman who is lamenting at her fate.
Exactly.
And quite unlike what Draupadi would have been like.
You know,
and that post. It then also reflects about or how people would like to see our heroines, right? You put them on a pedestal. You don't look at the colors, because she could have been wrong. I mean, the vengeance that she brought in, and that's the point that you make.
Yes.
That it was, you know, her ego being hurt, her vengeance, which brought about the war. Of course, you can justify it saying that it was meant to be, but in many senses, this painting and the picture that you present are two very, very,
very different. And in fact, I mean, far be it from me to criticize Raja Ravi Verma. That's not the point. But for me, this really does not exemplify Draupadi from the very start, from the fact that she's this fair woman here, you know, this Brahminical fair woman. Now, Draupadi was famously dark. You know, now we often forget it because the heroines who portray her in our popular culture now are so fair that we forget that she was celebrated for being dark. And in a country where people are, you know, brought into a state of self-loathing because of their dark skin, because they're told again and again they will not get a good marriage proposal, they will not get a job, they will not get a promotion if they are dark, and they spend their hard-earned money on you know, light skin lightening creams. We need to bring this back, and this is part of her story, that she was famously dark. She was celebrated for being dark. Many of her names, her monikers, you know, are associated with the darkness of her skin, the blue lotus and Krishna and warm gold and all these lovely terms that are used. So she was celebrated dark woman, and she was not a victim. You know, I think it is important to remember this idea of her weeping, you know, quietly. We rarely hear of her weeping quietly. She's more raging, you know, raging against her husbands, raging about the men who insult her, whether it is Kichaka, the man who tried to assault her, Jayadratha, who tries to assault her. She never starts weeping like this. She pushes them away. She's very physical. So this idea of a victim, this fair, you know, upper caste Brahminical woman who is just crying quietly in the corner, really is very far away from the Draupadi that I imagine her to be.
Right. You know, in Live History India, we try to steer away from mythology only because it is so overarching. It's so interesting that it often subsumes any conversation on history. And I don't want to go down that path, because we must look at both women from legend and real figures from history. And you've done such good work on that. But I have to tell you that what stands out for me in the Mahabharata is that, of course, historically, we know it would have been an earlier text because it refers to an earlier period. The Ramayana refers to a much later period. And the role of women is very interesting, because Draupadi might be a trailblazer, but she also sits along with fairly strong women. Who have, held their own, so to say. So your book is actually not just looking at Draupadi, but at the whole cast, so to say.
That's right. In fact, you know, coming back to this whole notion that I had of pollution in women and purity and impurity, really, when I thought about it, what it comes down to is a deep concern and fear about the sexuality of women, and how are men to control this fearful thing, which is a woman's sexuality, within the marriage constraints, within the Lakshman Rekha that Sita has. These are the boundaries that a society puts on a woman's sexuality, that you are allowed your sexuality within the holy bounds of matrimony to produce sons. This is the single place in which you allow this. So men are deeply, deeply concerned about the control of the wombs of elite women. And this we see it very clearly in the Mahabharata, right from the time of Ganga, Satyavati, Kunti, Amba, Balika, all these women, all the men around them are just really worried about how, you can see how the text is very worried and keeps writing and rewriting these episodes around them, wondering who controls their wombs. And these women within this incredibly patriarchal structure are still able to control their destiny to a certain extent. So whether it is Satyavati, this fisherwoman, without any power at all, any standing, who is forced to have a son out of wedlock before she is married, by the Sadhu Durvasa, and she has her son Vyas, who is at that stage taken away from her. At that point, she is powerless. She has no control over her destiny. But later on, when she's queen of Hastinapur and she finds herself without heirs, her sons are unable to have heirs, she brings in this son from her earlier encounter and uses it to her advantage. So I found it very interesting how these women were nonetheless in a society which was really trying to constrain them and put so many strictures on their life and their liberties. They were still able to have some sort of agency even within that structure, and behind the scenes, if you like, controlled a lot of the action.
So you've also not sugarcoated that, right? I mean, there is, of course, a reference to the demigods who fathered the sons of Kunti, but you have not, it's more kind of layered, your assessment of it. But let's move away from that. The tendency to make women sit on pedestals, or ignore them. So there are these two extreme reactions that we have. Do you think when you move from legend to actual fact, actual figures, this tendency continues?
Yes, absolutely. So, this was my first book. And after this, my publisher encouraged me to look at historical women. And so I wrote about my second book. And when I was looking at that, at historical women around us, I found that the layers and the layers of fabrication, of obfuscation, of whitewashing were really tremendous. A lot of effort had actually gone into this over the centuries. And no matter if the woman was just 200 years ago or 2000 years ago, the same sort of effort goes into molding her eventually into a Brahminical patriarchal notion of what a woman should be like. And even though these women in their own eras, in their own times, were often celebrated for these very same actions, whether they were looking for divine love, they were singing, or they were fighting in battle, whatever their actions were, they were celebrated at that time, 2000 years ago, 500 years ago. Yet over time, we find this tendency in all of them to be brought again within this mold. So in the end, all these women end up looking alike. They look like women from a Saas Bahu serial, all the same, with laden in jewelry, a very domesticated sort of woman on a pedestal. So these are women that you cannot emulate. You may want to admire them or almost worship them, but these are not examples for our girls, our young women to look up to and say, yes, they did all this. They were able to overcome difficulties. They were vulnerable. They were human. They cried sometimes. They failed sometimes. They were angry. They had ego, so they had all these conflicting emotions, and yet they were able to transcend. That's when you can be an example, to someone. Not if you are a perfect goddess. None of us aspire to be perfect goddesses.
You've picked out some women that you have written about and looked deep into their lives. And you are going to take us now through some of these women. And I'd really urge you to, look at some of the miniatures also that Ira has pulled out, especially when you come to the Mughal women, because these are again, I think it's thanks to Ira that I started looking at miniatures the way I did, because they tell you so much, right? They're not just paintings, but they really tell you so much about society, about the rules of engagement, etc. So you're starting with Amrapali, very interesting character, very powerful role in Buddhist texts.
Yes. Yes, exactly. And, we are talking about things like the fragility of women's voices and legacies. And it was when I was studying Amrapali that I realized exactly how fragile their voices are, because the only reason we have the voice of this woman who lived 2,500 years ago approximately is because her path crossed that of the first historically recorded man in Indian history, who was the Buddha. So we have this fascinating person called Amrapali, or Ambapali, some people pronounce it. But she lived in this Republic of Vaishali, about 500 BCE, around that time. And she was a foundling. She was an orphan girl. She had no parents, and she was found by some pretty poor people in a mango orchard. And they brought her up, and money was invested into her. So either she was very beautiful or very talented, but the people of Vaishali saw something in her and invested a lot of money into her to make her a Ganika. Now, a Ganika was a courtesan, but she was something very different from the idea that we have today of the courtesan. She was like a Japanese geisha. We would call her like the Lucknowi wife, but before it had the negative connotations that we have today with it. So, for example, if you look at the Kama Sutra, a text written around that time, they describe a Ganika and they say she was a woman of pleasant disposition, beautiful and otherwise attractive, who has mastered the arts. She has the right to a seat of honor among men. She will be honored by the king and praised by the learned, and they will seek her favors and treat her with consideration. And she goes on to master all the arts that are taught to her: singing, dancing, repartee, wit, poetry, how to hold a conversation, how to engage men with her art. And she became a very successful Ganika, a very wealthy woman. It is said that she built reservoirs and temples. So she was a woman who had independent wealth. And she had agency. She did this, in her own name, and had a reputation for herself. And then she comes, the king of Magad, Bimbisara, hears about her, which would be very normal, the famous courtesan of the neighboring town, and he has a long liaison with her. And then eventually Bimbisara dies, and the Buddha crosses the path of this amazing woman, and she's seduced by this message. Probably by this time she's getting a little older. Maybe she sees the end of her career as a Ganika looming large, and she decides to become a Buddhist monk. And so she joins the Sangha and becomes a respected monk over the years. And it is because of this that we have her writings, because the Buddhist monks compile the writings of the nuns as well. And we have a whole, the Psalm of the Nuns, which is an extraordinary document. I encourage all of you to read them because they are wonderful writings from women 2,000 years ago. And so we have it written, in that text that this is this woman, she was a courtesan, and they use it as an example of redemption, how you can overcome, certain transgressions and become nonetheless, whatever your life path. And then for many, many hundreds of years, we sort of forget all about Amrapali. This woman who had agency, who chose her destination, who chose her destiny twice, changes over twice. And over the years, she's forgotten. And in the 20th century, there's a Hindi language a book written about her, Vaishali Ki Nagar Vadhu, I think it is called. And in that, she is completely transformed from a woman who has agency and who controls her destiny into one who has become this screeching harridan who attacks the people of Vaishali. And she tells them, because of you, I've been forced to become a courtesan. So agency is removed from her when she has become this powerful and wealthy woman. She says, I am forced to become a courtesan, and I urge you to go and destroy the kingdom of Magad. So she becomes something that is completely the opposite of what she set out to be, what she was in the beginning, a woman with independent agency and means, and she becomes a fallen woman. So this is the way in which this very precious voice that we have, when we don't have too many of them, so we need to hang on to them. The story and the voice of Amrapali, she writes a poem which is recorded in the Psalm of the Sisters about the evanescence of youth. So should I go on to the...
Actually, I must tell all our circle members, in case you joined us in the recent months, we've done a fabulous piece on the Tehri Gathas, on these voices of women. You must try and catch that film on the LHI Circle. Please go ahead.
No, you must do, because those poems are fabulous. They're all about criticizing husbands and how awful they are, and you see the mundane concerns.
Oh, it could well be a modern day, tome.
Completely. Yes, completely. So if we can have the next slide, because I also lose track of who am I. This is Mirabai. So she was another fascinating character that I came across. You know, this 16th century Bhakti poet, poet saint that we have, one of the, I think, few pan-Indian, heroines that we have. And what's interesting about Mirabai is that there is very little written about her, very little textual evidence. There are her songs, of course, and there are hundreds and hundreds of songs, but very few are actually signed by her. I think perhaps only about a dozen, out of which many are lost. So we have a handful of songs that are actually properly attributed to Mirabai. The rest may be hers, but they may be just the songs of her devotees, because the message that she sent out resonated so strongly with the men and women across North India that many added their padas to her body of work. But nonetheless, we have some idea about her by piecing together the messages from her padas. And so she came from a noble Rajput family and married into a noble Rajput family. Now, we're not sure exactly who, maybe the Rathors of Chittor, it's not exactly clear. But she marries into an elite Rajput family. And one of the first things that would have happened to her was that this would have happened at a very young age, because the Rajput houses did practice child marriage and natal alienation, which meant that they were encouraged to send their daughters very far from the maternal home, so that they were completely disinherited from all notions of their parental homes, the support structure, so that they felt that in their new married home, they would have to adopt the new ways of life completely. They had no support structure. And this is something that Mirabai really writes against. And today we have something called the Bidhai genre of song and poetry, which sort of exoticizes this very same tradition. So we make it something to weep over, but also to celebrate. Whereas Mirabai writes some very strong poetry criticizing this natal alienation, this sending away of girls when they're very young, of disinheriting them from everything that they hold dear to them. So Mirabai enters this marital home and she's expected to worship the Kuldevi of that Rajput family, which she is unable to do because her heart belongs to Krishna, she says. When they are faced with this, her in-laws are very annoyed and she suffers all sorts of indignities at their hands. And at some stage, we are not sure when, she leaves her marital home to go into the countryside like a wandering minstrel and sing her song, The Divine Love of Krishna. Now, this was an extraordinary thing for an elite Rajput woman to do. We are not sure when she leaves, but Mirabai does talk about giving up silks and giving up jewelry, which she would only be doing if she left as a married woman. So this is quite a huge act of transgression, to leave your marital home while your husband is alive and to go unchaperoned, because the Rajputs at this time have deeply invested the idea of male honor with that of the sexual chastity of their women. So for Mirabai to leave the home, go unchaperoned, join the mixed company of men and women, and to sing the praises of Krishna in this environment was actually something deeply powerful and transgressive that she does. And in her poetry, she criticizes the marital home, she criticizes the custom of marriage, which just casts girls away. She criticizes her in-laws. She writes very movingly about the destiny of a woman who was just made to marry at a young age and adopt the ways of a new house. So I found this message so strong, and yet today when we see her, the reinterpretations in the 20th century, like from Gandhiji onwards, she is shown to us as a perfect widow in white. So it is assumed that she waited a long time, lived a long, happy life with her husband, and when he died, as a contented widow, when there was no risk to her sexual chastity at all, she left the married home. Whereas I see her more as this bow singer. In Bengal, we have these minstrels almost, and she would have left at a much younger age. She talks about wearing saffron robes. So she would have been wearing robes like this, of a renunciant and ascetic, and she would have been in mixed company of other singers, men and women. So we have sanitized her image. We have made her impeccable. We have made her this absolutely bloodless woman who never transgresses any of the Rajput dictums and just goes when she's a very respectable old lady. So that is the story of Mirabai that I found, and that I found very powerful even today. And the next woman, I think we do go on to, Razia Sultan. So she was very fascinating. She was of the slave dynasty, the daughter of Iltutmish. And what is fascinating is that we are talking about the 13th century. We're talking about a very volatile and fractious time, where we have this group of so-called slaves who have seized power in the sultanates. But it is a very troubling time where there are many competing loyalties. So you have, by the time that Iltutmish dies, you have a group of 40 slaves called the Chalisa who hold all the power at court, and they are very, very influential. Then you have the other freeborn Turk amirs who have their own loyalties. And then you have all the other siblings of royal blood. And Razia has to contend with all these different factions when her father dies. Her older surviving sibling tries to have her killed, Ruknuddin. He tries to have her killed at this stage because she is somebody who also aspires to the throne, which is something very extraordinary for the times. And what she does when she realizes that there's a threat to her life is that she appears at the terrace of her palace here, in Mehroli, Qutub Minar area, and she appeals to her soldiers and to the people of Delhi. And at this time, she is still in parda. She has a light veil across her face, but she tells them, "I am the daughter of Iltutmish." So in the she calls to mind the moral authority that Iltutmish has and that she carries as his daughter, as his capable daughter. And she says, "I am his daughter. They are trying to kill me. You must come to my aid." And they do, and they bring her to the throne. Now, probably what the Chalisa imagine when they first bring her to the throne is that she will be very malleable and easy to control, which initially, she is in parda and she holds court from behind a screen. But very soon she casts away that screen. She removes her parda. She starts riding her horse and her elephant. And she is easily seen by all her people and her soldiers. She starts minting coins in her own name. Initially, she was minting it in the name of the daughter of Iltutmish. Then she starts minting it in her own name. And she calls herself Razia Sultan, using the moniker Sultan and not Sultana, the feminized version of it. And so she rules for about 4 years. Eventually, she gets killed because the atmosphere at that time is full of bloodshed and violence. But she rules apparently well, is popular, and does as good a job as is possible at that time. And what is interesting is to see the way in which her legacy is first maintained and then slowly obliterated over the years. So, for example, you have somebody like the historian Sinhaj al-Siraj, who writes in the 13th century, very close to her time, and he says she was a great sovereign and sagacious, just, beneficent, the patron of the learned, a dispenser of justice, the cherisher of her subjects and of warlike talent, and was endowed with all the admirable attributes and qualifications necessary for kings. So she is equated to a king. Then Amir Khusro writes 50 years later, "For 3 years in which her hand was strong, no one laid a finger on one of her orders. In the fourth, since the page had turned from her matters, the pen of fate drew a line through her." So Amir Khusro is also quite matter of fact. He said it was her destiny that she died, and after 4 years. Then by the 14th century, you have the historian Isami saying, "I am told." So he's talking, he's making reference to probably bazaar gossip and what people are saying by this time. "I am told that she came out of parda suddenly, discarded her modesty, and became jovial." So this association of women with joviality, with laughter. "Everyone high and low used to enjoy the sight of her face. To wear the crown and fill the throne of kings does not benefit a woman." So already we see in the 14th century this scolding note that comes into the historians, which was completely invisible in her contemporaries, who admired her for her warlike qualities. 100 years later, she is told that to remove your parda does not benefit or befit a woman. And by the time we come to the 20th century, her story has completely been manipulated and transmuted into that of a love story. Now, this is a very popular trope where women are concerned. You make them into the object of a man's passion, and thereby you remove all agency and all power. So she had, in fact, promoted an Abyssinian Ethiopian slave called Yakut, because she thought, like her father did before her, that to promote a deracinated person meant that they had more personal loyalty to you, which is exactly what happened. And he was very loyal to her. But by the 20th century, it becomes a foolish love story. She unnecessarily allowed this man to become too close to her, to view her face, as they say, and this has become just a hopeless love story once again. So, yeah.
Right. In fact, Bollywood does that, right? It everything into a romance. The whole history of India is a romance, basically. But I must tell you that I did go to the tomb of Razia Sultan with Swapna Little in Delhi.
Yes.
And this
Yes.
is in Turkman Gate, beyond Turkman Gate. And what is so sad, and I always make it a point to refer to this, is so sad that this trailblazing woman from the 13th century who stood outside, I mean, the mosque, opening her veil and saying that, you have to be, backing me for the throne. And there her grave lies. And it's in such a bad condition, Ira. I'm
Yes.
sure you've seen it, because the settlements around it are just gradually caving in over here.
Yes.
And the only reason it survives is that it's a mosque, a partial mosque, so to say, and hence it survives.
Yeah.
But it's really sad, I mean, history has been unkind, and I think we continue to be unkind to her.
Yes.
But please go on. I had to say, add that aside, and also a reminder to all our attendees, please do pose your questions in the chat box. Ira will be taking your questions after this brief presentation. Ira, over to you.
Thank you. Yes, and she was a trailblazer, not just for the 13th century, but we have not had many women who have ruled as kings, have ruled as sovereigns. So we really need to guard their, their memory very, very carefully instead of allowing this to happen, which is really very sad. And I think the next woman that I talk about is Mahamanga. Yes, so I'm very fond of Mahamanga because she's one of the few non-royal women that I was able to talk to. And I'm often asked this question, why don't you write about non-elite women? Why don't you write about common women? And the fact is that if it is hard enough to find historical evidence for elite women, you can imagine how scanty the information is for non-royal, non-elite women, almost non-existent. But this woman, Mahamanga, who is shown here to the left of the young Akbar in yellow robes, was a foster mother or milk mother of Akbar. Now, this was a very powerful group of women because we know that Akbar was more or less abandoned by his parents when he was just about 1 year of age, when Humayun and Hamida Banu Begum had to more or less exile themselves into Persia because they were threatened by so many enemies. Akbar stayed behind in India, and he was looked after by an entire coterie of milk mothers and their children and their husbands. So he grew up surrounded for 2 years, entirely, at a very vulnerable stage, entirely looked after by these milk mothers and their families. And he had a lifelong loyalty, therefore, to these women and their children. So Mahamanga was the superintendent of this group of about 10 or 12 milk mothers that he had. And what I found extraordinary about her is that I just stumbled, one day when I was doing a history walk, in Delhi, and it was very casually mentioned that this quite amazing mosque structure that we were visiting. So we had just seen the Dinpana, the old fort where Humayun had ruled from, and we crossed over and we came to the structure and we were told that this is called the Khairul Manazil. This is the mosque and madrasa complex built by Mahamanga. And later on, when I thought about it, I really wondered how amazing it was that this milk mother, who was not a royal woman at all, who died quite early, was able to have the money, the wealth, and the agency and the desire to build what was actually the first Mughal monument of the time. So we have this extraordinary structure, which is now in ruins because nobody really cares about it at all. And if you see below, it is the calligraphy says this was built by Mahamanga in the time of Akbar and all that sort of thing. So she has put her name to this structure and she has claimed ownership of it. And in its time, it was a large and beautiful important mosque and madrasa structure. It has 2 levels, as you can see on the sides, which is quite unusual. And it would have been covered in tiles, would have been a very beautiful structure. And if we go to the next slide, I continued walking around the area over the years, and I found something that, that was quite extraordinary. Now, if you look at the little pink circle that I've drawn, that denotes the Dargah of Nizamuddin Aulia. And he was, in a sense, the patron saint of the Mughals. Now, the Mughals used all sorts of signs to claim their legitimacy to power, as kings always do, and they used poetry, they used Persian miniatures, they used architecture. And one of their signs of legitimacy was their closeness to the Sufis. So early on, Humayun and Babur were close to the Naqshbandi Sufis, but from the time of Akbar onwards, it was the Chishtis of Hindustan. So Nizamuddin Aulia became this his dargah became a very powerful symbol for the Mughals. And all the structures which are in blue lozenges are important Mughal monuments, because the closer you could be to this sanctified space, it's almost a vortex of sanctity where the saint is buried. The closer you are to him, the more powerful you are, because not everybody could build a structure or be buried. And all the ones that I have shown are all related to women in some way. So the topmost one is the Khairul Manazil that I was talking to you about. Now, if you can see Humayun's tomb, you can imagine the tomb of Humayun, which became really the tomb of all the Mughals. Many Mughal, hundreds of them are buried here. It is buried so close to Nizamuddin Aulia's dargah, but Mahamanga's Khairul Manazil is built no further. So it is built really close. So I was really surprised to see that, and to tie it up to what she had done, to her buildings, to the fact that she was close enough to be buried, powerful enough to be buried so close to the saint. The fact that Akbar would be passing in front of her Khairul Manazil mosque every day, if he went to see the tomb, or if he went to Deen Pana. And so this was something that I thought I could tie into her story. So when we talk about the legacy or the evidence that we have for women, it is also things like this. If you look at the arrow that is pointing away, and I'm saying 12 kilometers, that actually shows where Mahamanga eventually was buried. I think she probably intended to be buried at the site of her mosque and madrasa complex, because it is very large. In the middle, there would have been space. But unfortunately, her son Adham Khan transgresses certain boundaries. It's a long story. He gets killed by Akbar, and 40 days later, Mahamanga dies of grief, and she is also buried in a sign, I think, of Akbar's almost annoyance at Adham Khan. He buries him not next to Nizamuddin Aulia's tomb, but far away at Qutbuddin Kaki's tomb, which is another Sufi saint, but not the one who is as revered by the Mughals. So that was an interesting phenomenon for me to see. And the other few lozenges that I haven't talked about in depth are all related to another milk mother, Gigi Anga. Now, she was a woman who has written nothing, who has built nothing. We find no textual evidence of her, but she is beloved by Akbar. We know that he loved her perhaps above all the other matronly figures of his life. And she has influence, we see, through her family members who are able to be build structures so close to this tomb. So we have her daughter buried with Abdur Rahim in his tomb. We have her son, Aziz Koka, who builds his tomb as well right there. And she herself is buried in Atka Khan's tomb, which is also her own tomb, her husband and her. So, these are the various ways in which when you are looking for the voices of women, the disappeared voices of women, you can add, so I could add all this information to the fact that Mahamanga had built this structure, to the fact that she was politically important for 2 years, to flesh out this woman that we know very little about, and who tends to be written even today in a sort of scolding manner that, she was very greedy for power and she controlled Akbar for those 2 years, whereas actually she was a very capable and able woman to whom Akbar was happy enough to cede power for a little while until he came into his own. And then we have Gulbadan, who is, of course, his aunt, who is a great example of how women's histories are forgotten, because she wrote a biography. Now, this is a very unusual and rare text that Ruby Lal, our historian, has written about. She's written a book based on this biography of Gulbadan. Akbar asked Gulbadan to write her memoirs of her father, her father Babur and her brother Humayun, and she does this. And this amazing, unique document that we have from the 17th century, from inside the harem of a 17th century woman, 16th century woman, this document, after being written, was completely forgotten. It was forgotten by future historians. They never referred to it. And finally, it is in the 20th century that it is found in the British Library, translated into English, and again forgotten for decades, until Ruby Lal finds it and writes her groundbreaking book, Domesticity and Power in the Early Mughal World. And she writes about how important Gulbadan's voice is, how we must take into consideration the power and influence that women had in a very different way from the men. So maybe they were not fighting the battles, but what were they doing? How were they carrying forward the legacy of the Timurids, the Mughals? Gulbadan also went on a Hajj, which was extraordinary for the time. She went with a group of 20 women, much against the wishes of Akbar, who thought it was much too dangerous. Unfortunately, she never wrote about it. So when I was trying to recreate the idea of how she went on the Hajj, I had to use indirect sources. So if we look at the next image, it is the image that accompanies a document called the Pilgrim's Companion. So these were books that came out almost like a Lonely Planet guide to certain places, and this was for Mecca, Medina, to go on the Hajj. So you see these beautiful diagrams, and this gives you an idea. You can see the mixed company of men and women in the right hand side picture. You can see the woman under the tent. Her face is unveiled because you're not meant to veil yourself when you are in the holy lands. So this gave me material. You can see the wonderful ship on the left and the scary monsters that are jumping about in the water. So this helped me when I was recreating Gulbadan's Hajj, which she never writes about herself. So these are the sort of indirect ways in which I was able to write about Gulbadan. And I think this is, of course, one of my favorite miniature paintings. And as Minnie was saying, it's so important. I really became very, very interested in miniature paintings when I was writing Daughters of the Sun, because this wonderful image, very rare to see images which are only women, only royal women, and certain women that we can probably name. And the woman who's sitting on a seat, the only one who's sitting on a chair in yellow robes and a gray shawl, is Hamida Banu Begum, the mother of Akbar. And she's sitting proudly here because her daughter-in-law, the Rajput princess Harka Bai, the princess of Amer, has just had a child. And the other Timurid woman sitting on the floor is either Bega Begum, Hamida Banu's co-wife, or perhaps Gulbadan herself. It's not sure. Of course, these are representations of women. You are not allowed to directly, paint an actual woman. So these are representations that show their Timurid origins. You can see the caps that they're wearing, the loose robes they're wearing. At the same time, you also see how by the time this painting was painted in the late 16th century, the court had become so much more heterogeneous. So you have the indigenous influences, you have the Rajput influences, you have the woman playing the dholak, you have the cholis and the ghagras and the ordnis in addition to the Timurid robes. So this woman in the middle who has just had her child, Salim, the future Jahangir, this is Harka Bai, and the painter is imagining that this is what she looks like, and we can see that she's a dusky woman because pertaining to her Rajput origins. And we know that she had a great influence in the harem. For the first time, we have a Rajput woman who comes into the Mughal harem, who is allowed to bring her rights, her religion, her habits, all her entourage comes with her. She doesn't come alone. She comes with this huge entourage of women who carry this culture, and they bring a huge influence, which is written about by many other writers, by Badauni, who's very critical about this and blames all Akbar's so-called Hindu innovations on his Hindu wives. And yet, today, when we write about Harka Bai, we again, if you come to the next story, we again imagine her to be as this sort of passive object of a great man's love. So she again becomes the object in a love story, and I think that is really demeaning the influence that Harka Bai and the other Rajput women had, because it was so much more profound, it was so much more lasting. So this is just something that we need to look at more carefully, that it's not just a very innocent thing when somebody is made into a love interest. It is actually whitewashing a lot of her other influence, apart from the fact that she wasn't Jodha. She wasn't from Jodhpur, she was from Amer, but that is just a minor point. The names of women are often forgotten. And I think the last woman is Jahanara Begum. I don't think we have a great amount of time, Minnie.
Please go ahead. Please.
Yeah, okay. So this is again a wonderful miniature, because there aren't, as I was saying, many pictures of these royal women. And again, this is an idealized image. It is from, I think, the Dara Shikoh album, her brother. And so even though this may not be what she looked like, it's interesting that she's holding a manuscript, because she's meant to be a very learned woman. She was a very learned woman. She was a woman who wrote 2 books, which was pretty extraordinary for the times. And she wrote it in an attempt to be accepted as a Sufi peer, as a Sufi master, because she and her brother Dara Shikoh were extremely interested in the Sufi movement and spent many years studying under the masters. And I think she had an ambition to be, to be accepted as a Sufi murid, Sufi peer in her own right. But eventually she is told, no, a woman cannot be a peer. It is not acceptable. So she had to put aside that ambition. And again, the reason she wants to be associated with Sufism is also partly because it is one of the legitimizing factors for the Timurids, for the Mughals. So she is claiming in her own right the right to call herself the Timurid lamp, somebody who is upholding the traditions of this ancient Timurid lamp. The Mughals considered themselves descendants of Timur, so called themselves Timurids. So she, in her own right, not only as the daughter of Shah Jahan, not as anybody's wife because she was never married, or as the mother of sons, she had no sons, but in her own right, she says, I am a Sufi. I know the Sufi teachings. I have written 2 books on the Sufi teachings. She later goes on to build huge swathes of Shah Jahanabad when Shah Jahan constructs Shah Jahanabad. So she is on par with her father, who's the famous builder, of course, of the Mughals. And so she does these various things, which if you put them together, you see that and she spends a lot of money. She has trade ships. She uses that money to invest and create more wealth, which she then uses to build these many, many structures. So if you put all this together, all that she accomplished in her life, she has the most exalted ambition of all the women that I have studied. She was considered herself, I think, no less than her father or her brother Dara Shikoh. And if who knows if things had turned out differently. If Dara Shikoh, we keep thinking, what if Dara Shikoh had ruled? I think she would have almost been perhaps co-sovereign. Like Noor Jahan is meant to Ruby Lal proposes that Noor Jahan was co-sovereign with Jahangir. But unfortunately, all these beautiful structures that she built, this was one of the reasons I wrote Daughters of the Sun, when I realized this famous Delhi woman, Jahan Ara Begum. I am a Delhi woman. I consider myself a Delhi woman. I had never been taught about her. So I felt this sense of loss, this sense of theft, that I have not been given access to these stories. I have only been told one side of the story. And one of the reasons we are not told about her is that these beautiful caravanserais she built, the hammams she built, the gardens she built, and the chowk that she built have all been destroyed, mostly post 1857, when the British retook Delhi. And in place of her beautiful caravanserai is this rather charmless town hall, which I believe today is being put up for sale, but nobody wants it.
Right. There are gardens behind this, and it's Mahatma Gandhi Gardens, but it's very interesting. Ira, I'm going to squeeze in a couple of questions because we've got some viewer questions also, but I must make a point that, Harka Bai, what I found amazing, who was Akbar's wife and Jahangir's mother, was also a businesswoman. She had a fleet of ships that took people on the Hajj, and most of these Mughal women were also very rich because they had commercial entities of their own, perhaps are the earliest business women of India, because even Jahan Ara could afford to have that caravanserai. She earned revenue from there, and they were independent. Yet, I must make a point of this. We were trying to do a film on Fatehpuri Begum, whose masjid lies at the end of the Chandni Chowk. So just imagine, you have the Red Fort on one end, you have this great Chandni Chowk with the sarai and this lovely market. And on the other end, you have a mosque built by Fatehpuri Begum, who's also a wife of Shah Jahan. All we know about her is that she was from Fatehpur Sikri, because the name, but there's nothing about her, which means that, 99% of the Mughal women were non-existent, really, from a historical point of view.
Yes, absolutely. Because, from the time of Akbar, it was deemed that these women were now so exalted because His Majesty was, semi-divine, and he was so, exalted himself that anybody associated with him, his family, his women were above reproach, were above even, you could not even pronounce their name. So they were given a title. They were Maryam Uz-Zamani. Harka Bai was known as Maryam Uz-Zamani. Hamida Banu became Maryam Makani. So you even forgot their names. You forgot, because of the names, you forgot their origins. You forgot everything about them. So they were really obliterated separated from the record. And it is very extraordinary when you have a woman like Jahanara Begum who puts her name on things, and we are able to, put together the idea of her legacy. And yes, the fact that they had these trade ships is incredible. Harka Bai was an incredible businesswoman. So as you were saying, the pilgrims were transported at one end, but so was cargo, and indigo was one of the most precious cargo at that time. It brought a lot of money, and she had indigo fields, and she had wells built to water her indigo fields to make sure that they prospered and did well. So incredibly talented businesswomen who managed to carry out all this business from within the harem. So they had a parallel sort of political economy happening in the harem, which sort of mirrored the outside world. They had their own agents, their own people who dealt with the outside world, accountants, and so they were able to carry out all these practices despite being in Parda.
Right. I'm going to take some questions very fast. Tara has said that, of course, the Tehri-Gata is truly wonderful. She loved it. Many thanks, Tara, for pointing that out. Nitin Dalvi says that I did visit Razia Sultan's tomb. Apparently, there is some dispute whether this was really her tomb or was there something else in Mehrauli. Can you shed light on this? I will go with what Swapna told me. Yes. And the likelihood is that was Razia's tomb, also because it's close to a shrine, a Sufi saint's shrine. Also, it was very far away from Mehrauli. They didn't want even the qabr of Razia anywhere close to the sanctum sanctorum for the slave dynasty, which was the Mehrauli area, because most palaces and things were there. And remember, at that time, the Turkman Gate and where Razia's tomb is, was really way out on the Grand Trunk Road. I mean, so there was very little access to it. And so that is most likely the place to be Razia's tomb. Annie says that history continues to repeat. There are equal or more percentage of women than men in the world, yet women keep teaching their children that boys are supposed to be strong and push ahead, and girls are supposed to be beautiful to attract boys and finally get married, etc., which I agree with. It's terrible. Everything that we do, I kind of iterates that, and it's terrible. But of course, now men also have to be on a diet to be on screen, which is great. They also have which I feel very happy about. But yeah, so Annie says that actually women should insist on having higher social and career status than men, not just equally. Only women can change the social norms set by men for their own benefit. Totally agree. And kudos to women like Ira, who are helping us understand all of these beautiful stories to iterate that women indeed did play a very important role in our story. There is a question from Antwa saying, any plans to translate your books in French?
Yeah, I would love to, but I don't know how interested the French would be in these stories. And also to find a publisher who does do translations is not that easy.
But I'm sure there is a lot of interest on women histories, especially, because it's a universal problem, right? The story of Mary Magdalene.
Yes, it is not so Indian.
Parallels to Amrapali. I mean, it's amazing how these stories run, in parallel lines. Absolutely. There is another question. Even today, it is men who write characters of women in mainstream media and even in social media. This is changing, of course, because you've got some very, very interesting women writers also. But the question is, do you think it has any difference from the portrayal of women in ancient and medieval dramas and novels? And do you think such portrayal further leads to the subjugation and commodification of women? What is your view? Do you think anything has changed in the way we portray women, either our historic figures, our women from our mythology, or even our contemporary women?
I think there hasn't been, it is only recently, I think, that there has been some pushback and some change, maybe in the last few decades. But till very recently, I find, at least, in the examples that I've given, it is really in the 20th century that these women have been so completely whitewashed and so completely presented. The nationalist movement, of course, also co-opted this idea of women as Bharat Mata, as being this perfect goddess. So everything sort of, got influenced by that as well. And it is a problem, and I think it will only be corrected once we first take cognizance of this fact that actually we are perpetuating the same old myths and stories which fit into a certain, patriarchal norm. Once we are able to deconstruct that in our minds, I think then we are able to write more clearly about these stories.
One last question from Nitin Dalvi, a very pertinent and important question. The women discussed seem to be primarily from northern and central India. Did you have a chance to look at historical records of powerful women from western and southern India? Nitin, please check out the Her Stories section on Live History India. We've done numerous stories. And in fact, I was telling Ira that we are doing a film on Ahilyabai Holkar, another spectacular woman from the 18th century. And you can't imagine how much she has done, the kind of legacy that she's left behind, the work that she did in restoring the temples across India, for instance, just one small part of what she did. And we will be releasing that and sharing that with you. But Ira, this, of course, the selection was based on who you have written about. But I could say that in Kashmir, you have Queen Dida, who's, again, very, very maligned by history, for instance. And there are many, many such characters. So are you going to look at a wider spectrum? Who have you, kind of identified?
So yeah, I'm often asked this question, and I do write, I have written it in my introduction to, I think, Heroines, that I'm conscious of the fact that I write mostly about North Indian women. This is, I suppose, firstly, what I am familiar with, what I feel equipped to talk about, and which I feel equipped to talk about vis-a-vis the life I live and the impact it has on me, the cultural sort of milieu that I have been surrounded by. And also one has to be pragmatic and start somewhere. But eventually, yes, I would definitely, but there are so many books to write, Minnie. Who's got the time to write everything? And there are so many women to write about as well.
Many, many thanks, Ira, for joining us. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.